The late 1970s projected an aura of absolute unbreakable permanence for the Soviet Union, a superpower stretching across 11 time zones. Its mechanized armies and nuclear arsenals cast a long, freezing shadow over the globe. The Cold War, a geopolitical struggle for ideological supremacy, had carved the world into rigid spheres of influence. Moscow dictated the fate of half of Europe, its borders seemingly impenetrable, its internal contradictions masked by iron-fisted state control. But beneath the frost of this monolithic empire, microscopic fractures were beginning to form. What if the very act of trying to secure a fragile border state became the mechanism that dismantled a superpower? In December 1979, the Kremlin faced a crisis on its southern periphery. Afghanistan, a fiercely independent nation historically resistant to foreign domination, was unraveling. A newly established communist government in Kabul, loyal to Moscow, was rapidly losing control over its own rural population. Fearing the collapse of a friendly regime and the potential spread of Islamic fundamentalism into the Soviet Central Asian republics, the Politburo made a catastrophic calculation. They authorized a massive military intervention, intending a swift surgical strike to stabilize the Afghan government, replace its erratic leadership, and withdraw before the world could effectively react. Operation Storm 333 initiated the Soviet-Afghan War with brutal efficiency. Elite Soviet commandos, operating under the cover of darkness, infiltrated the Taj Beg Palace in Kabul. Their objective was the assassination of the Afghan president, clearing the path for a more compliant successor. Simultaneously, the formidable Soviet 40th Army rolled across the border, columns of heavy tanks and armored personnel carriers carving through the harsh winter terrain. Within days, major cities and vital communication lines were under Soviet control. The initial invasion was a textbook execution of rapid mechanized warfare, projecting an image of overwhelming, unstoppable force. Yet this projection of dominance was a dangerous mirage. The armored columns that easily secured urban centers were fundamentally ill-suited for the environment they had just occupied. Afghanistan is a fortress of jagged peaks, deep valleys, and unforgiving deserts, a landscape that neutralizes the advantages of conventional, heavy military formations. The Soviet doctrine relied on massive firepower and rapid maneuverability across open plains, strategies that were instantly rendered obsolete in the Hindu Kush. By securing the cities, the invaders had unknowingly locked themselves in a cage, leaving the vast, untamable countryside to an enemy they did not yet understand. That enemy was the Mujahideen, a fractured but fiercely devout coalition of tribal fighters united by a singular purpose, which was the expulsion of the foreign invader. The term Mujahideen translates broadly to those engaged in a struggle, and their resistance was framed not just as a national defense, but as a holy war against an atheist empire. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, and mountain tribesmen, armed initially with antiquated rifles and an intimate ancestral knowledge of the terrain. What they lacked in heavy artillery, they compensated for with unparalleled endurance and a willingness to embrace staggering casualties. The clash immediately devolved into a textbook example of guerrilla warfare. This military doctrine avoids decisive, large-scale confrontations with a technologically superior force, relying instead on ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run tactics to bleed the enemy over time. The Mujahideen utilized the mountains as both shield and weapon. They would strike Soviet convoys navigating narrow mountain passes, destroying the lead and rear vehicles to trap the rest, before melting back into the caves and ravines. The 40th Army, trained for a conventional war against Western forces in Europe, found itself fighting shadows. The conflict did not remain isolated in the Afghan valleys. It rapidly escalated into a pivotal Cold War proxy war. A proxy war occurs when major powers instigate or play major roles in a conflict without directly fighting each other. The United States saw an unprecedented opportunity to give the Soviet Union its own unwinnable quagmire. Through covert operations, Billions of dollars in funding, weapons, and training began flowing through Pakistan to the Afghan resistance. The local tribal struggle was suddenly supercharged by the industrial and financial might of the Western Bloc. As the 1980s progressed, the Soviet leadership stubbornly refused to acknowledge the reality of their failure. The strategy of attrition, the military concept of wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous losses in personnel and materiel, was failing spectacularly. The Politburo continuously poured more troops into the theater, escalating the violence. They initiated brutal scorched earth campaigns, heavily bombing rural villages and destroying agricultural infrastructure to deny the Mujahideen food and shelter. Millions of Afghan civilians were forced to flee, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. But the scorched earth tactics only hardened the resolve of the Afghan fighters and alienated the local population completely. Soviet conscripts, young men drafted from across the vast empire, found themselves thrust into a nightmare. They were fighting an invisible enemy in a hostile climate, suffering from rampant disease, poor morale, and a growing realization that their presence was deeply unjust. The psychological toll on the Soviet soldier was devastating. The zinc coffins returning to Moscow, initially hidden from the public eye, became a silent, damning testament to a war that made no sense to the mothers and fathers of the fallen. The turning point in the tactical landscape arrived in the mid-1980s with the introduction of the Stinger missile. Supplied covertly by the United States, this shoulder-fired, heat-seeking anti-aircraft weapon fundamentally altered the balance of power. Soviet air superiority, primarily their reliance on fearsome attack helicopters to provide close air support and transport troops across the impassable terrain, was suddenly neutralized. The Mujahideen could now strike back at the sky. As Soviet aircraft fell burning into the mountainsides, the logistical lifelines of the occupying force were severed. The loss of air dominance paralyzed the Soviet war machine. Logistics, the complex military science of maintaining supply lines and moving troops, became a daily fight for survival. Convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, and food from the Soviet border to bases in southern Afghanistan faced a gauntlet of ambushes. The cost of maintaining the occupation skyrocketed. The Soviet economy, already groaning under the weight of systemic inefficiencies and the broader arms race, began to hemorrhage capital it simply did not have. The Afghan mountains were not just consuming Soviet lives, they were devouring the economic foundation of the empire. This economic bleed coincided with a critical shift in the global balance of power. The aura of Soviet invincibility was shattered. Nations within the Eastern Bloc, watching the formidable military fail to subdue a nation of poorly equipped tribesmen, began to question the ultimate authority of Moscow. The deterrence factor that had kept satellite states in line for decades was fatally undermined. If the Soviet Union could not win on its own borders, how could it guarantee the security or enforce the compliance of its territories in Eastern Europe? The psychological foundation of the empire was cracking under the strain. By 1985, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, ascended to power in the Kremlin, inheriting a state in profound crisis. Investigating the true cost of the war, Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet-Afghan War was a bleeding wound that could not be closed through military force. He faced an agonizing strategic dilemma. To remain in Afghanistan was to invite economic ruin and continued international isolation. To withdraw was to admit defeat, humiliating the military establishment and potentially destabilizing the communist government in Kabul they had sacrificed so much to protect. Driven by the urgent need for domestic reform, Gorbachev chose the bitter pill of retreat. The withdrawal was a complex and dangerous maneuver, executed over several months. Unlike the rapid, confident invasion a decade earlier, the exit was a somber defensive operation. Soviet forces had to secure the main highways, fighting off relentless Mujahideen attacks simply to guarantee a safe passage home. In February 1989, the last Soviet commander walked across the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan, symbolically ending the occupation. The military left behind a devastated country, millions of landmines, and a shattered infrastructure, taking with them the deep scars of a profound strategic miscalculation. The immediate aftermath of the withdrawal created a massive power vacuum in Kabul. The Soviet-backed government managed to cling to power for 3 more years, heavily subsidized by Moscow. But without the occupying army to enforce its rule, its collapse was inevitable. The Mujahideen, united only by their opposition to the Soviets, immediately fractured along ethnic and tribal lines. The war against the invaders seamlessly transitioned into a brutal civil war, plunging Afghanistan into a new era of chaos and warlordism, setting the stage for the rise of even more radical factions. However, the most seismic tremors of the Soviet defeat were felt not in Kabul but in Moscow. The withdrawal acted as a catalyst for the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. The myth of the invincible military was dead. The staggering financial cost of the war accelerated the economic collapse that domestic reforms were desperately trying to prevent. Furthermore, the returning veterans, disillusioned and traumatized, injected a profound sense of cynicism and anger into Soviet society. The state had demanded the ultimate sacrifice for a lie, and the social contract between the Communist Party and the populace was irreparably broken. Consider the trajectory of the late 20th century had the Politburo chosen restraint in 1979. Without the immense financial drain and the devastating blow to its military prestige, the Soviet Union might have managed its internal decline over decades, rather than collapsing in a sudden, chaotic implosion. The Cold War might have dragged on well into the 21st century. The decision to invade was the fatal overextension, the classic blunder of empires throughout history, stretching their military power beyond the capacity of their economic and political foundations to sustain it. The legacy of this conflict reshaped the global order in ways the architects of the invasion could never have imagined. The power vacuum and the subsequent civil war in Afghanistan provided fertile ground for radical ideologies to take root and flourish. The network of foreign fighters who had traveled to Afghanistan to battle the Soviets, radicalized and battle-hardened, formed the nucleus of future militant organizations. The weapons, the training, and the ideology fueled by the proxy war metastasized, creating a new paradigm of global conflict that would define the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. The Soviet-Afghan War stands as a monumental testament to the limits of conventional military power against asymmetric resistance. It demonstrates how a superpower, armed with vast mechanized fleets, can be brought to its knees by the harsh realities of geography, the unbreakable will of a local populace, and the suffocating cost of a prolonged occupation. The mountains of the Hindu Kush became the graveyard of Soviet ambitions, a brutal terrain that absorbed the shock of an empire and reflected it back as a fatal blow. Ultimately, the eras shifted not on the plains of Europe where the Cold War was expected to be decided, but in the remote valleys of Central Asia. The invasion, intended to project strength, instead exposed terminal weakness. It accelerated the end of a bipolar world, dismantled a totalitarian superpower, and inadvertently unleashed forces that continue to shape global security today. The echoes of those heavy tanks rolling across the border still resonate, a stark reminder that the collapse of empires often begins with a single catastrophic miscalculation.